Hello everyone, this is the CBOR working group meeting at IETF 112. My name is Christian Amsus. Barry Labour is chairing with me and will be joining us shortly. Let's get started. This is an IETF meeting, so the note well applies. This means that this is a public meeting and it is being recorded. It also means that if there is anything in terms of patents or other IPR that you're aware of, please state that, or do not talk about that topic at all. This also means that we all want to be nice to each other. This is supposed to be a space where everyone can talk up freely, so please ensure that people feel welcome here. If you have any questions about any of that, please follow the links that are within the slides indicated here in pink, or talk to me or the Ombuds team, depending on what kind of questions arise. On our agenda for today, we have a few topics. First block is working group documents. There I'll just give a brief update about documents that are sent to the RFC editor or are work in progress without any particular updates that need discussion here. Then filling in for Michael, who is also busy in another meeting, Carsten will tell a bit about issues that have come up late in FileMagick. And then we'll continue with CBOR Pact, looking at the open questions that we'll have to answer there before the document can move on. And after that, there will be a few words on the topic of notable tags, and a large block on the future development of CDDL. And apologies for whatever happened in there that it says notable tags. That's why I stumbled here briefly. The individual document that should be here is not notable tags, which is also something that will need work in the work group, but was not planned for today. I don't know what happened here. What should be it should be saying here is application-oriented literals extended diagnostic notation, which is something that I'd like to ask about whether or not we should adopt that. Are there any changes you'd like to propose? Any additional topics that we should bring up today? Okay, hearing none. Hearing none, let's go to the documents that are that actually have left the working group already. Just giving a brief update on what changed there in the steps that not all of you might have followed. CDDL control got switched over to the standards track and is now in the RFC editors queue. Network addresses in the latest iterations after the last IETF gained support for zone identifiers, which may be numeric, may be textual, or may be absent as they always were. And this now is also in the RFC editor queue. The time tag document we adopted in May is still active, but this is largely waiting for input from the state working group, because whereas much of this is rather uncontroversial, the topics of time zone indication that will also be supported in the CBOR time tag will just need to wait for whatever comes out to date. But judging from having seen the minutes and how often this has come up in hallway discussions, I conclude that the group is rather active and we just follow what is happening there. If there are no comments or questions on those documents, I'll hand it over to Carsten for the next topic of CDDL control. Of FileMagick.
Thanks. So let me try to get my slides there. Nice. Okay, so I have one slide deck for FileMagick, Pact, and for CDDL 2.0. So let's talk about FileMagick first. So what do we have at the moment? We have a way to use 555799, which is a tag that already was defined in 7049, as together with a 1+4 tag identifying a specific kind of data item, and thus the file format, to get an 8-byte prefix for CBOR data items. But that only works for single data items. So if we want to have a magic number for a CBOR sequence, then we would use a new tag, which is defined in this document, which is also a 1+2 tag plus a 1+4 tag. So together we have 8 bytes plus a conventional content for that tag, which is the byte string BOR, which miraculously becomes CBOR when you look at its representation. So that would be a 12-byte prefix you prepend to a CBOR sequence. It stays a CBOR sequence, but it just has this additional entry that identifies it as what the tag NNNN says. So that is stuff we have had for a while, and then we thought, well, it might be nice to actually have pre-allocated tags for CBOR content formats. There are 2 to the 16 CBOR content formats, so it only takes a small byte out of the 1+4 tags. So we define one 1+4 tag for each of the 2 to 16 content formats, and we actually managed to do this not with a table, but with a simple arithmetic. And so that was all fine, and we thought we were done. But then I made a big mistake and put in examples into the document that actually are non-CBOR content formats. So all the things on this slide really work with data that are in CBOR form, either a single CBOR item or a CBOR sequence. And of course, the mechanism just doesn't work for data that are not CBOR shaped. So these examples are really misleading. And the comments came in that we would need to do byte string wrapping for these data to fit them into either 555799 or 55800, which one could do. But then it would no longer be a constant prefix that you just have to slap in front of your data. So it would be more work. I mean, it's not a killing amount of work, but it would be more work. And it would make it harder to peel off that prefix. So it would be a much worse situation. In addition, you wouldn't necessarily know whether you need this byte string wrapping or not. So this is a non-starter. That doesn't make sense. So we wanted to have a version of the document ready for the deadline for this IETF, but that threw a monkey wrench into that. So we since have discussed this some more, and came up with the idea that maybe we spend another tag, which would be 55801, which is essentially works like 55800. So you prefix it to something, but the something that you prefix it doesn't need to be CBOR data. So this would be almost, but not entirely, unlike a CBOR sequence. This works with CBOR decoders that can decode one item and then hand up the raw data for the rest of the input. So for instance, in the Ruby CBOR implementation, there's an interface called decode with rest, which takes one item of data, of binary data, a byte string file, and gives you the decoded item plus the rest of the data in undecoded form, and this is exactly the API that would be needed for this. And yeah, that happens to be a relatively common API. I cannot guarantee it's everywhere. But if you don't have that API, just read the first 12 bytes and decode that. So that should do the job. So with the addition of this, we would be able to actually define file magic for all CoAP content formats, which I think is desirable, but it's a bit of a scope creep for this document, I must admit. So I think this is not a no-brainer, but we should think about that. So assuming that we can reach consensus to put this in, the job would be to actually put it in, to keep this non-CBOR content formatting with 55801s. And again, the examples that I made kind of assume that we already have that, but it doesn't distinguish between CBOR and non-CBOR, so that was the problem. So these examples would be kept, but changed to talk about 55801. And we would add a couple of examples that actually have a CBOR content format using 55799 and 55800. So that would be -07, and then we would go for working group last call with that. So that's my plan.
Comments, questions? Michael, please.
So I think that the 55801 is a good solution. But I did ask, I don't know if we have this problem. And so I would a little bit tend to, unless someone really thinks we should do that, I would tend towards let's not go there and just stick with what we have. Also concerned about the review content comments that will result in these things that are way beyond CBOR.
So we have one comment in the chat that says add 55801.
Just to get a bit of a better view, would we still have use cases for CBOR for content format numbers in all those three categories? That is 55799, 800, and 801.
Yes.
Or could we slim this? Is there any of those that is kind of where we don't really have a full use case?
Well, if we didn't have a use case, we shouldn't do it. Yes, I think that there are examples, meaningful examples that can be put into the document, and I think it's useful to have these examples because we are now opening up a choice of 3 different ways to do things, and it certainly helps to explain when you use what.
So just taking my document shepherd hat here, the byte string version has been in there for the -05 and -06 versions, which was what the working group last call covered. So I'd like just to point out that if we extend the scope here, this will put the document through definitely through another working group last call and probably a bit of designing on the way there. One thing that was pointed out in previous discussion that might help here is that many of the things in this document kind of set out to do have already happened by early registrations, which, as I checked, only affect the kind of the parts unaffected by all this. So that's not a reason not to do it. It's just something that I'd like to put out and make people aware of if there's any urgency on the rest of the document.
Yeah, just to give an example, the one example that I would build for 55801 would use the content format 11542 application/vnd.oma.lwm2m plus TLV. Because that's a weird format where it really helps if you actually can identify it by a magic number. Christian, I think your audio totally broke down now.
Hang on. Is this better now again?
Yes.
Okay. So I've heard a bit of I've heard some positive input and some cautious input on going forward. So I suggest that this can be explored in a -7, and that the examples there will hopefully make the use case clear enough that we can go on with this. Thank you. Then next up is Carsten again with PACT.
Yeah, so this is the slide I had in July. So the main issue is table building, and I think we need to not boil the ocean here, but on the other hand have something that has batteries included. So I'll come to that in a minute. Maybe I should use the fact that this points to Chris Zip's records tag proposal for a quick intermission. So I just sent some additional comments to him on the mailing list. And I think that's a pretty good proposal. And people, if you if you think you have comments on that, please send them to the list, because I think that will be a pretty useful addition to our library of tags. So let's go to PACT. So PACT really is three things. It's a processing model, which is in contrast to actual compression schemes based on in-place usage of the PACT data item. So you do reference chasing in the data you got. Then it's the registration of a number of tags and simple items that allow you to reference items. So these are the origins of those arrows that the processing model foresees. And I think we have a pretty good understanding where in the CBOR basic data model we have the gaps where we can put these references in. And finally, and this is the part that isn't quite as stable as the rest, the table building, and in particular the nesting aspect, where we may have more than one place in the data item where something is added to the table. And I think we now have a pretty good understanding of a push model or shift model, depending on how you think about it, where you essentially have a stack of tables, and pushing something on the stack means that you get control over the lowest numbers in the various reference and the various referrer encodings, and push the existing table entries up to higher numbers. So I think that is now well understood, if maybe not fully described. So that's probably a place where at least editorial work is needed. And basically what I think we should be doing in the base document is provide The referrers, of course. So we have allocated tags and simple items for sharing, for adding prefixes, and for adding suffixes. We describe the table model, including the push mechanism. And we probably should describe this in a way that we can add future kinds of referrers. For instance, using the record or template proposals. So the model is extensible, but we only fill it in for the three kinds: share, prefix, and suffix. We add a basic table setup tag that is making use of the push model and pushes to the share, prefix, and suffix tables. So that's pretty much already there. It probably just has to be qualified as something that is just one way to do things. And then we provide a framework for defining more specific setup tags, where I think we should foresee two kinds of setup tags, but of course it's always possible to define other tags. It's just these are the two that I expect we will make a lot of use of. One is an implicit reference. So if an application protocol defines a dictionary, like we did 20 years ago with the zip encoding, zip compression dictionary, there's an RFC that has the bytes of the dictionary in it. And similar here, you would write in the specification that allocates this tag the actual table that would be pushed on to this push model for tables. So the advantage, of course, is that you can have very, very short setup tags if the application requires that. And you don't have to do complicated lookups. It's really just a tag. When you implement a specific application, then you implement the tag for that as well. And then you have your application-specific dictionary included. So this is kind of for standardized dictionaries, where standardization doesn't necessarily mean going through ISG, but somebody makes the effort and writes a specification that then registers a tag. And the other part of the framework should be hashed references. So the table setup tag would include a hash value and probably also a COSI algorithm identifier, COSI hash algorithm identifier, to explain how the hashing is supposed to be done. Hashing, of course, needs a specification for how the hash input actually should look like. And that, I think, should be pretty obvious by simply hashing the CBOR deterministic encoding of an equivalent basic table setup tag. So we don't have to invent a lot of mechanism for this. We have everything. We just have to put it together in the right way. And of course, an implementation might just implement a number of those hashed references, or it might have a way to actually get that hashed reference somewhere. That's not really something that the data format defines. It just says if you have a hashed setup tag with this hash, then insert it here. So that's my plan for the base document. And then we can, of course, go ahead and do circumfix and template and record and whatever kinds of packing we come up with. Comments?
Just for understanding, records would then be a use case of packed, and whoever defines the records would set up the table to have these specific semantics. Is that the intention?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think the record proposal in its standalone form, as it is defined today, maybe with a couple of tweaks that I've identified in my mail, that's actually viable. So we wouldn't need to put it into the framework, but maybe we want to. So I think that depends a lot on what applications this tag would be used in.
Okay, thank you. Henk?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Ferdi, this is Henk. So unfortunately, Brandon cannot here with us today due to a time conflict, but I want to highlight that I think it would be really cool to use the now finalizing suit manifest specification as an example for CBOR Pact. I think that would be something we can start after this is moving out of the gate, because this will take some time. But I think it would be an excellent exercise to instantiate this in real life.
So can you explain use as an example, because that triggers some different neurons for me.
Okay, so I think that there is a lot of redundant references in directives and for example identifiers for several things like classes or environments or software, effectively in the suit manifest. And my assumption is that and Brandon really works on trimming down every single byte. And I think as the manifest is already pretty much compact, I assume that the pact approach will still yield a significant reduction of size. So that is something I would like to just try out.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether you want to use it as an example in the document.
No.
Okay.
So it would be the suit 2.0 or the suit pact manifest, because we can't do this with a real one. If we delay this any more further, someone will throw stones at me. So that isn't possible. But immediately, as this is stable and out, I would like immediately redo it with pact, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, one interesting question, of course, would also be whether you can simply use suit as is plus pact as is and get anything useful out of that.
Yeah, that is part of the experiment. So we have to find out. So, but again, Brandon and I will not be doing this year, to be honest.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Maybe around the next hackathon before the IETF in some hopefully actual location, that would be nice.
Okay, so that maybe leads into a general request for data items. So if you have any data items that are not entirely trivial and that would maybe benefit from CBOR Pact, we might want to collect these data items in a repository so we understand what CBOR Pact does to them. And of course also how good different Packer implementations would be, because the Packer implementation can have different qualities of implementation. That there is no one way to pack things.
Christian here, brief question on Packer implementations. Do you expect these to be widely used? Because my impression was that that most of the time packing would be done in a more static way, so that the application would use its information on the structure already to create the tags. Do you think that kind of free-form compression is something that we'll need to expect in the in applications?
That is a good question. So if you have a generic packer, we probably should call them this way, then you may save some time in your application actually doing these things. But of course, it requires to actually build the full structure and then submit it to the packer. So it's not something you would do in a constrained implementation. In a constrained implementation, you would always generate CBOR packed right from the data that you have. So yes, I see some areas where generic packers might be useful. And that's why I think it's a good idea to collect some best practices for building them. But also the how do you say that, packing-friendly CBOR encoder APIs might also be an interesting subject of doing hacking work.
I see Hank in the queue.
Yeah, just one quick question, because I have no gut feeling for this. How easy or effective would be an auto pack feature in contrast to a manually, I want to say, configured packing of content, where you guide that a little bit? Should be this almost the same in the end?
Well, that depends on how much machine learning and AI you put into your packer.
Okay.
But generally, writing compressors is a pretty well understood area of work. So I would expect that if you write a generic packer, that will often be as good as your manual packing scheme is. And it will also find some opportunities for packing that you simply didn't address in your manual work. So in effect, it might be better.
Yeah, maybe not compared to Brandon, but in general, yes.
Good.
On the queue. So let's go on. I don't think that there are prepared slides for the EDN. Is there something that you'd like to say there, or shall we keep that for basically last for the AOB section? And
let's do it now. So we had some positive feedback during the interim. We haven't implemented that yet, which always makes me a little bit hesitant of going for something like a working group last fall. Hi, Barry. But we might go for adoption. That certainly would be possible at this stage.
So maybe just a brief show of hands around the room, given that we have almost 20 participants. Could you please indicate using the show of hands tool whether you have whether you are interested in that document for working the working group? Well, I just have to find the right. Yeah. But I take this as kind of a preliminary show of interest in the document. This is not kind of on its own an adoption call that will be later on the mailing list, but this is just a brief thing to gauge the interest in the room. And I see a lot of hands going up here. So in the minutes, please note that this is even within a short show of hands, showing 7 out of 20 raised and none not raised. So to me, this shows that there is interest in the working group, and I think we can handle the rest of the mailing list. Thank you. Next item, please.
Okay, so let's go to CTDL 2.0. We have talked about that in the last full IETF meeting, 111, and I gave some hints for how this and that particular piece of it might look like. And what I want to do today is maybe give a little bit more structured overview over where I think CTDL 2.0 should go. And well, we have done a few low-hanging fruit in the CTDL control specification, which gives us a few things that are already good on the way to 2.0. But there, of course, we only could do things that didn't actually require changing CTDL. We just used its extension points. And what I'm describing now really is going beyond using extension points. And to me, it seems that there are two aspects that are also low-hanging fruit, but low-hanging on the way of actually extending the language. And one is annotation and the other one is composition. So let me talk about those, starting with composition. So right now, CTDL works with a single file. I mean, we don't even talk about files because there is no file structure, so there's no reason to talk about files. But in practice, you have a single CTDL file. Maybe you concatenate that together out of several input files. But essentially, the thing is a sequence of rules. And the first rule, which must be a type and not a group, is the entry point. So at surface value, the whole CTDL file defines one data type. And this has been quite useful, but we probably want to go beyond that. And I think what I hear most is that we actually want to build libraries, which are CTDL files that export one or more rules, well, typically types, but might be groups as well. And we also want to be able to import those rules from another CTDL specification, whether that was intended as a library or as a standalone CTDL specification doesn't make a big difference. So we want to have an export interface and an import interface. And to be able to do this, it probably makes sense to actually be able to name the library. So when you do an import, you have something you can talk about, what you are importing. And you also want to control the naming of the exported or imported rule. So an existing CTDL spec might want to export something, but maybe it has a very short name in that spec, and there are reasons why you don't want to change it. I come to those reasons. And you want to export it under a more useful name. Or when you import something, that something may have a very short name in its context, but in the context where you are pulling it into, that short name is misleading. So if you import something that has the rule name signature and you have a specification that has 3 different kinds of signature, you don't want to call it signature. You will want to call it foo signature if it's coming from the foo specification. So there is some management of names needed. So I have shown a simple way of doing implicit importing. So we might have a convention that causes a tool to actually find a library and reference things from there. So rfc1990.oid might be something that at some point every CTDL tool will understand. So you don't have to do lots of things to actually get it. And if you actually need a short name, you can simply write another rule and say OID equals rfc1990.oid, and then you will have a short name for this thing. So the implicit mechanism would be an easy way to do things without completely leaving the CDL 1.0 envelope. But of course, the tool has to support doing this lookup. And the more powerful explicit import would identify a library, maybe identify a versioned sequence using a semantic versioning reference. So that's a very popular subject, and I think the young people have been discussing this for about 2 years now. So maybe we can actually steal something from them. And then when you have identified the library, you want to manage what names are introduced. I talked about name management, potential conflicts, and so on. So this will be the explicit import interface. I'm not putting an example in here because I'll come to the syntax in a few slides. So the export interface would provide a way to name the library. So you don't just have an anonymous CDL file, but the CDL file itself says under which name it expects to be imported. Gives a version number, probably, semantic version number. And you probably also want to identify the rule names that this library intends to export. So this is not a required list for the importer, it's just the default set. So if you just import the library without saying anything else, you get this exported rule set, but you can import less and you also can import more. So we are not trying to do protection of class internals here. I mean, if you do that, then you know that you are doing something on your own. So if the next version actually changes the name of a rule, then you have a little problem. But in particular, during development of things, that may be a much too useful thing to leave out. So the question, of course, is how do we do the linkage? So somewhere on my laptop, there is a CDL file that says it exports foo, and somewhere else, there is a CDL spec that says it imports foo. But how do these two files actually meet each other? And one way, of course, is doing this outside the specification language. So you essentially give some CLI parameters that tell the tool that these specification files are going to be used as the library files going into that other specification. So that's certainly one way to do it, and that's again useful during development. When the specification has become more established and maybe even standardized, it should be possible to give a hint inside the spec. For instance, a URI that points to a GitHub repository or something. So you don't have to repeat all that information in every call of a CDDL tool. So I don't have a problem with hardwiring GitHub in here, just as long as we have other ways of referencing repositories as well. Yeah, namespacing, that's probably the best way to handle these name conflict and bad naming issues. So rfc1990.oid already shows the idea of a namespace. So there is an rfc1990 namespace from which we import the OID rule. And while we are at it, we could maybe make the one board that that 8610 has, where we have a defined prelude that is always imported. We could make this part of the model, so you actually get control over that. It's a little bit like C++ using namespace std, except that you don't, the default is to actually do that, and you would have to do extra work to not do that. And maybe we actually want to think about some mechanisms that allows you to continue working when you have some namespacing errors. In particular, if you work with revisions, that might happen quite often. So that's the namespacing. Let's talk about alternatives. Many people want to use the same CDDL specification for different formats. For instance, you have one specification that explains how to do SendML in JSON, and another one how to do it in CBOR, and we know how to do this manually. The SendML specification defines it a manual way. CDDL control gives an example of another manual way, but we probably want to make this a little bit more first class. We don't do this on the lexical level alone, because that always makes it hard for implementations to actually process this. So if we make the alternatives first class, we might actually be able to define, to write a tool that does translations between the two representations. I mean, if everything lines up properly. So this would not be part of the specification, but it would be an interesting implementation project. So that's why I want to have alternatives be first class and not just be done on a lexical level like in the SendML spec. Finally, we should make this whole thing more accessible to automation. It should be able to actually generate libraries. So if you have an RFC that has some CDDL in it, and I think we now have a 2-digit number of those, it should be possible to generate the libraries from those automatically, and that should also be possible for new IDs. So we probably want to establish a few conventions how you expose CDDL in a draft. We cannot define new conventions for RFCs, but we can define them for new drafts. We want to be able to generate libraries from IANA registries. There are several registries that are just very, very useful. Think about interface types, which you just want to be able to use in a specification. And of course, what I'm saying here for documents and registries is not just for IETF sources, but this should also be possible for non-IETF sources. So if there are interesting registries or interesting documents that we want to extract CDDL from automatically, that we should look at those. And yeah, that should be possible from a CDDL spec to trigger that automation, not in the sense of we run a random operating system command. That's always a bit dangerous. But it should be possible to just point to an internet draft and say, I want to import the CDDL from there and put it in that namespace, and that should be possible. That's probably not the way you actually publish your specifications in the end, because, well, of course, you would reference an RFC and no longer an ID and so on. But it would be good to make the language accessible for this kind of automation. Okay, let's talk about syntax for a second. The idea is to do this transition from 1.0 into 2.0 in a way that you won't notice that it happened. So CDDL 1.0 files should still be 2.0 files. And CDDL 1.0 processors should be able to do useful things with 2.0 files. They won't be able to do everything that you can do with 2.0 files, but it would be good if these processors can process 2.0 files. And yeah, there are several places where we can stash things into 1.0 syntax. Yeah, that's one way of doing it, but this needs to be designed, so I'm not sure how exactly it will look like, but I showed some examples at IETF 111. Okay, so this is the syntax. Finally, the other part that I think we should be doing in 2.0 is annotation. CDDL has a processing model that can be described with Kernighan's car, which interestingly doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, so you will have to find it somewhere else. So you put in an instance and a model, and the thing says yes or it says no. And we have extended that with .feature a little bit, but that's still the main processing model. The CDDL tool can do more. It can annotate a tree with rule names. So that's really useful, but there is no control the spec writer has about that. So is it important that the data item matches text, or is it maybe more important that it matches country? So a lot of these rules are actually noise when you annotate trees. And of course, you want to be able to put information into the specification that goes beyond rule names. And finally, rule names are these things that don't have a relationship to the real world. So maybe we should do something about that. Other validation languages have something called a post-schema validation instance, which is a term I would like to avoid, but let's use it for now. And a PSVI actually uses the validation process to augment the data with, for instance, with annotation information, and possibly even to transform it. So filling in default values, constructing data from data that has been parsed, and so on. This is all things that can be done in a PSVI. We don't want to reinvent XSLT, so the transforming mechanism will be limited. But yeah, something maybe is useful here. The interesting question is, what is the data models for that? And it's probably useful to be able to put attributes on any data item, and maybe even to have some richer types, maybe even things like application-specific EDN. So we would need to think about representations in various forms, and particularly in CIBA diagnostic notation. So for annotation, I think the minimum viable product is to be able to put attributes on rule names. So you can select which rules actively annotate, and maybe associate rule names with some real-world concept, the UI thing I talked about. You might have special description attributes that you just extract out of comments, some additional spec writer defined attributes. So for instance, a unit could be added to something. Yeah, you could even generate tags that are not on the wire because the schema implies them. And this already can be, in many cases, can be taken from the unwrap information. So if I have a tilde time somewhere, I know that that number is a tag 1 time. Okay, and final slide, how quickly should we be able to do this? Again, I think this is low-hanging fruit. So my objective is to have a prototype and a written up spec by the end of the year for composition, and probably for first elements of annotation, but that probably requires some more playing around with actual applications. And my objective is to have a complete spec at IETF 113. And well, then we can decide whether we are done or want to split this document and publish parts of it and publish other parts later after some more experience. but I think we can only discuss this at IETF 113. Comments, questions?
Hank? Hello, Hank. Please unmute yourself.
No, I'm muted. I'm just being polite, I guess.
Okay, so maybe my mic didn't open in time.
Okay, yeah. So this is Hank. Obviously, I'm a strong supporter of this. We encountered several pain points without a strict composition feature. This also includes how we define code points in over maps. Like, are they global for a document, or are they specific to certain subsets of a single CDA? Sorry, I'm saying document here, but what I mean is a CDA data definition. And so yeah, this really, so we have a lot of ideas how this works, and I hope some of them we can find consensus on in this document. That would be really, really great, especially because I do not think that these documents will come to working group last call before IETF 113. So if this timeline is realistic, that would be awesome, because then we can incorporate it already. And so yeah, I'd say I would even go so far in splitting out more time to do this, and I'm in full support of that part. On the annotation part, unfortunately, again, Brandon is not here. I think he has some really, really constructive views on this. And so maybe in the next interim, we can reel him in and elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, we might also run a design team meeting if we want.
Yeah, sure. That is even better if we have a higher frequency on that, and then we can use the interim to discuss major turning points or something, like singularities or something.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up too. So design. This is an ambitious timeline. If this is to work, I think this will need design team meetings in addition to the interims. My rough plan would be to start interims again in around December 15th in our regular schedule. But even with these and the holidays in between, this will a lot of work by the authors. Speaking of which, Hank, Hank and Carsten, would you collaborate on this document, or do you have are there other interested parties that have shown up so far that would volunteer to work on this too? I mean, it's not a working group item yet, so it's technically speaking, it's still up to you, Carsten.
Yeah.
But anticipating.
Yeah, I expect that I will write something like a seed document, and then people will come in and contribute, and at some point we decide they are co-authors. So I didn't even think about that yet, but I know that Hank has been pinging me whether I'm going to do everything about this for a while. So I knew that Hank was going to contribute, and Brendan, of course, would make an awesome contributor or co-author. Anybody else who has an opinion on this? Wants to write text or code?
As a user of CBOR, I'm not sure I will write much text or code, but I'm quite looking forward to the annotation features, and especially curious whether this this work might allow later to not only to use the validation to extend annotation in such a way that you can also verify whether your CDDL allows unambiguous annotation, because right now validation is always unambiguous, but many CDDL documents out there do not allow unambiguous annotation. And if if the annotation extensions facilitate checking this, I would appreciate this a lot.
Great.
Hank, again?
Yeah, again, thank you, Hank. I haven't brought this up yet because that is there's nothing really tangible yet. So take this with a grain of salt, but I think that some supporters, and they are rallying fast at the moment due to some other things like in the cozy realm, a CDDL IDL might manifest these requirements for it that is coming closer to the annotation part. So an IDL might not. So the messages for the input output for RPCs basically make up like I don't know, majority portion of all of that. So there might be again external syntax that can glue that together, and that might make use of some of the annotation parts. So I'm just highlighting this because this is just all, I don't know, pipe dream today, but it might manifest faster than one thinks in the next months. And so why is this interesting? Because there might be offers on that from that pool of interested people. But I could not name a single one today with any reliability.
So I was in the SCIM meeting 2 hours ago, and that would be a nice benchmark for doing something like that as CIM. Barry is co-chair for that, so maybe he's now in fight or flight mode. We might want to contribute something to that, but we can use it as a benchmark, and if it turns out to be useful, we can still try to contribute to the standardization effort.
I have to highlight that the other project that is really interesting in the CDDL is also called SCIM. But it's a totally different SCIM. It's the supply chain integrity model. So yeah.
Maybe we should just start going for 5-letter acronyms.
Yeah, probably this is the time now. Like with the 5-digit RFC numbers or RFD numbers or whatever we're gonna call them then.
Okay. We are already in overtime, so I'd take any last comment if there is still one. Other than that, thanks everyone for all your input. As I mentioned, interims are planned to resume in the same cadence that we had them during the last ITS. Probably starting December 15th. Mail will go out on that, and also always on topics that we just took a rough reading on here. For example, the interest in EDN. With that, read you all on the mailing list. Thanks, and have a nice rest of the IETF. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.